Welcome to Pump in Python. My name is Jacob Itegboje, and in this video, I will cover how to handle exceptions in programs. This is a continuation of the video on how to test that an exception is raised, which showed how to verify an exception is raised when testing. Let's add a test. I'm going to add a method here, call it define, say test, catching exceptions, add self, and then I'm going to call a function from the exceptions module called raises exception. I get an attribute error because the exceptions module has no attribute raises exception. So I add that. Here I say raises exception is equal to none. And the terminal shows me an attribute error that it has no, oh, I put this in the wrong place. So I should open the right file. That helps. I say exceptions.py. Okay, raises exception. Assign it to the null value none. I get a type error. I add that to my list of exceptions encountered. Type error. Okay, I need to make this a callable, so I make it a function. Define raises exception, return none. And we have a passing test. Now, to deliberately raise an exception, I can use the raise keyword in Python. I say raise and give the name of the exception, and it will raise an exception. I can also pass in a message. So if I wanted to say boom, for instance, I add that to it, and it raises an exception. We saw in the previous video that I can catch an error, an exception in test using self.assert raises. So I'll do the same thing here with self.assert raises exception, hold on and indent the line, and we have a passing test again. All right, let's add another test. This time I want something that will handle exceptions in the test. So I say test catching failures. Self, say self.assert equal, like when I call exceptions, the exception handler, and I pass in exceptions dot raises exception, I should get failed as my result. The terminal shows me an attribute error. There is no attribute exception handler. So I add one, I say define exception handler. I know it's going to be a function, and I return none. I get a type error because my signature takes 0 positional arguments, but one was given in the test. So I add an argument to the definition, and I get an assertion error. None is not equal to failed. I change none to failed, and we are green again. All right, the problem here is the exception handler will always return failed regardless of what I give it. So if I add a test here that says define test catching successes, and I pass in, let's say I say self-assert equal, I call the exceptions dot exception handler function, and I pass in something that does not raise an exception, I should get succeeded as my response. Let's see what happens. I get an attribute error. Exception has no attribute, does not raise exception. So I add it. So it does not raise exception, and I assign it to the null value none. I get an assertion error. Failed is not equal to succeeded because the exception handler currently only returns failed. I needed to do something with the input. So first I'm going to change this argument and name it function. It should take in a function and return the value of calling the function. I get a type error for test catching successes because non-type object is not callable. And for test catching failures, I get an exception when that line is called. We're heading in the right direction. First, I change this to a function, say return none, and I get an assertion error. None is not equal to succeeded, and in test catching failures, I get the exception. So now I can write an exception handler. In Python, we do this with the try statement. We say try, try something that could raise an error like function. If it's exception, if it raises exception, it will raise an error. If it does not raise exception, it will just return none, so it won't raise an error. When it can raise an error, we do except. When it can raise an exception, we do except the exception it's going to raise, and then do something. In this case, I wanted to return failed when it encounters an exception. And then there's the else clause for when it doesn't raise an exception, it returns succeeded. And we are green. So when the exception handler raises exception, which raises an exception, and it calls it, an exception is raised, it returns failed. When it calls does not raise exception, no exception is raised, it falls to the else clause, and it returns succeeded. There's one more piece of the try statement that you can use, which returns the exact same thing you want. It's called a finally clause. It ignores the except and else clauses. So if they have return statements, that is, I say test finally always returns self.assert equal. If I call exceptions dot always return and I pass in exceptions dot does not raise exception, it should give me always returns this. I have an attribute error since always returns is not defined, so I define it always returns, say it's going to take a function, and it returns the function call, the value of the function call. I get none is not equal to always returns this because when I call does not raise exception, it's none, so it's returning none. But it should be returning always returns this. I'm going to add the exception handler, say try function except exception return failed, else return succeeded. And I get an assertion error saying succeeded is not equal to always returns this. This is because in functions, the return statement is the last thing that's executed. So when it calls does not raise exception on line 17, no exception is raised, so it ignores 18 and 19. It goes to else and returns succeeded. But I wanted to return always returns this. Even if I add a return statement below that, it's not going to run because the return statement is the last thing that's executed. For me to force this, I have to add finally. So if I say finally, return always returns this, then I get the expectation. So even if I call it with something that fails or that raises an exception, like I say, exceptions will always return. I pass in exceptions dot raises exception, and I say failed. I get always returns this. And there you have it. You have seen how to catch an error in a test using assert raises with the name of the exception in parentheses. You can catch any kind of exception. Module error, module not found error is an example. Attribute error is an example. Any exception, as shown by line 19, can be caught using assert raises to allow the test to continue, and test catching failures and test catching successes shows that we can write an exception handler. We can catch errors and handle them in programs using try except else or try except else finally. We also encountered an assertion error, module not found error, name error, attribute error, type error. That's it. Do you think you are ready to take on how to measure sleep duration? That's the next video. See you there.